Well, thanks very much, Deb. And may I also extend the welcome of TEQSA staff and the TEQSA commissioners to you all. It's great to see another big crowd at a TEQSA conference, and we're really looking forward to interacting with you over the next couple of days. I'm going to talk about, I guess, four things. First of all, to give you a snapshot of the sector that's developed over the last 12 months. I'm going to talk a little bit about positives and negatives about TEQSA's own performance. And I'm also, along the way, going to be drawing on some information that we published a few months ago in our Assessment Insights report. That's a report that's publicly available on the website of TEQSA, and I do hope that people find that of interest. It gives us some insights about what's been happening in terms of regulatory decision-making by TEQSA over the last 5 years. And then lastly, I'm going to very briefly touch on what's coming up over the next 12 months or so. So here's the profile of the sector at the moment. The figures there are drawn from information from the National Register of about a week ago. We have 169 providers at the moment on the register. 43 of those are universities, and there's been absolutely no change in the university sector over the last 12 months. We have 126 higher education providers, which you've already heard we are now calling private independent providers and TAFEs. 126 of those providers, 12 of which have self-accrediting authority. So only 10% of the higher education provider category providers have self-accrediting authority at the moment. There's been a little movement in the sector in terms of the numbers of providers over the last 18 months. We've had 4 providers exit the sector and 7 providers come in, all of those being in that private independent sector. There's lessons to be learned, I think, by the 4 providers that have exited the sector in the last 18 months. 2 of those did so voluntarily after deciding that they wanted to exit the sector and made quite appropriate arrangements for the transfer of their students while doing so, working with TEQSA and with another provider in terms of making sure that their students weren't significantly disadvantaged. We cancelled the registration of 2 providers. Those 2 providers actually had a change of ownership recently within the last year or 2. And actually then got into gross financial difficulties through their activities in the vocational education and training sector. And that calamity brought about by the collapse of their vet activities produced collateral damage to the newly owned higher education provider that they'd acquired, and so it went down with the ship. And so that's led us to think about whether or not, when there is a change of ownership, we need to be taking a much closer eye at who's made the purchase, beyond just saying, are they fit and proper people, but who's made the purchase, what's the financial health of the parent, and matters such as that. The figures about the student numbers and their distribution relate to the most recent figures, so 2016. So there are more than now the just shy of 1.5 million students in the higher education sector at the moment, and you'll see that more than 90% of them continue to be enrolled through the universities. I'm now just going to show you a few slides about the financial health of the sector. This has been in the news a bit recently. So you'll see, going from left to right, that in 2016 the total revenue of the sector was just short of $26 billion, and in the last year that's grown to just short of $36 billion, up to $38 billion. So $2 billion increase in revenue in the last 12 months. Half of that has been derived from revenue from international students, and just shy of $1 billion from increases in government grants and programs, and also increases in revenue from domestic students. There's been a healthy growth of revenue over the last 12 months, 5.8%, but you'll see the growth in international student revenue has been much greater than that, rising from $6 billion to $7 billion, a 17% increase in international student revenue in the last 12 months. And that's occurred in all parts of the sector, so that growth has not just been in the university sector, but in fact growth in each of the sectors has ranged from somewhere between 10% to 31% growth in international student revenue. Expenditure, just a few highlights there. The biggest item of expenditure in the sector is on staff, and that's risen about $1 billion over the last 12 months to a total of $20.6 billion. Staffing expenditure is the biggest item of expenditure for universities, for TAFEs and for not-for-profit providers, and that ranges from about 57% to 62% of their expenditure. In private for-profit providers, staff expenditure represents about 39% of their total expenditure. Expenditure on marketing and promotion increased by about $95 million, up to $622 million. That expenditure, again for universities, TAFEs and not-for-profits, represents about 1% of their expenditure. For the for-profits, it represents 15% of their expenditure, but we have to be cautious in interpreting that figure because almost certainly the fees paid to international student recruitment agents are actually included in that figure for the for-profit sector. But still, there is a very significant expenditure on marketing and promotion across the sector, particularly in the for-profit part of the sector. And our capital expenditure across the sector, $3.7 billion, has been roughly steady. Last year, 2017, we had a variability in the profitability of the sector. At the left-hand side of the graph here shows the proportion of providers in various categories making a surplus or a profit. And you'll see that both universities and for-profits, a very small minority, about 1 in 6 or so providers were in deficit last year. But for the not-for-profit sector, half the not-for-profit providers last year were in deficit, and for TAFEs, nearly 2 in 3 TAFE providers of higher education were in deficit. Now, I hasten to say that being in deficit doesn't mean that you're insolvent. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's unexpected, because many deficits in organisations are planned and allow for investment in new initiatives, innovation, investment in infrastructure. But I think if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, where it shows the median sector surplus over the last few years, I think you can see that it has been shrinking, and certainly the sector at the moment, whilst financially in good health, individual providers are in fact obviously finding things a little more difficult in terms of going. A few words now about the risk profile of the sector. I spent quite a bit of time at last year's conference talking about risk. I'm not going to spend as much time today, but just to provide you with a few highlights. In 2017, we saw quite a significant increase in risk in the sector, largely due to two reasons. First of all, a change in policy by us to include providers who had poor quality data. In the past, if we had no confidence in their data, we would just put that to one side and treat that outside of the risk framework discussions. But this year we decided, or last year we decided, that what we would do would be to include those providers where we had no confidence in their data as high-risk providers. So part of it was related to a policy change of ours, but there was also very rapid student growth, and as well as that, there was evidence of a decrease in progress rates and satisfaction rates being expressed by students. So there was a spike in risk last year, and I'm pleased to say that the last risk assessment cycle that we've concluded actually does show improvements, and I'll show a couple of slides of that in a moment, really with, first of all, a great improvement in the quality of the data being provided by providers, and then secondly, improved performance against a variety of risk indicators, including improvements in progress and attrition rates, decreases in student-staff ratios, decreases in academic staff casualisation, and increases in graduate satisfaction. So I must say that we're hopeful that this trend will continue and that the risk in the sector will continue to diminish over the next few years. So just to show this to you now graphically, this slide's organised so that low risk is shown in green, moderate risk in orange, and high risk in red. We've plotted here the number of providers in each of those categories, and for each category of risk, we have shown the data from 2014 to 2018. You'll see that there was that spike in high-risk providers in 2017 that I've just mentioned, but in 2018, the latest risk cycle, that's shrunk back to about levels that were recorded in 2016 and 2015. There's also been a gradual increase in the numbers of providers rated as moderate risk to students, and that's been really explained by two factors. First of all, a shrinkage in the number of low-risk providers. They've gone up a category, as well as a pushing down of risk, people moving from the high risk to the low risk category. We're encouraged by the decrease in high risk providers, and we're anticipating, as I said, that this is going to continue to be demonstrated over the next few years. Here's the risk to financial position, far less red and a lot more green on this slide than the previous slide. But you'll see that there has been gradual growth in high risk and moderate risk numbers of providers over the course of the last 5 years, and I think that reflects the financial information that I just presented to you a moment ago. So now that we've got information, at least 5 years information of risk in the sector across the annual risk cycles, what we've spent the last 6 months or so doing is firming up our policies with regards to our regulatory approach and our regulatory stance in relation to risk in the sector. And for low-risk providers, we've certainly made efforts to reduce regulatory burden. We've introduced a policy that if you are now have a sustained record of low risk in the sector, we'll be offering you the opportunity to accept an invitation to extend your registration period. We're about to introduce a core minus approach. You'll remember that we assess according to a core set of standards, and then we build on those standards depending upon individual provider characteristics and risk. So now we're beginning to develop an approach which will allow us to subtract from the core set of standards, standards which we think aren't necessary to be looked at in terms of registration or course accreditation, and we'll be offering that to low-risk providers as well. And we're also seeking to enhance our monitoring capability through a range of interesting projects we're doing, including looking at social media posts in terms of quality of providers, And over the next few years, I'm quite hopeful that as our monitoring capability increases, we'll actually be able to, by and large, get out of the way of low-risk providers and simply look for an annual statement of certification and some periodic interventions in that regard. On the other hand, for high-risk providers, where we're seeking to increase our focus, we're seeking to increase engagement and dialogue with those providers. We met with a number of providers earlier this year that have been rated high risk to students for a number of years, and certainly TEQSA staff found those conversations quite helpful. And the outcome of those conversations, I think, give me some confidence that high-risk providers are taking the matter seriously and are making strong efforts to try and improve the outcomes for their students and the quality of their offerings. Let's now turn to TEQSA's performance. First of all, we saw some commendations, continuing commendations for the guidance and support material that we're providing, and also the quality of the information that we're providing with regards to our regulatory actions. A note about guidance notes and guidance material generally. This is a bit of a two-edged sword. The guidance notes are there to try and provide advice and assistance to the sector about what TEQSA looks for when making judgments against one or more of the related standards. They're meant to be no more than that. They're meant to give people some advice about what we look for and perhaps some interpretation of the sorts of evidence that might be presented. Some people say they're too vague, they're not sufficiently prescriptive. They don't inform people exactly what they've got to do. Others say, of course, that in fact now, quite improperly, TEQSA has introduced another set of standards, a sort of a quasi-standard that sits over the top of the official standards, and therefore it's making it more difficulty, more complex in terms of the life of providers. We emphasise again, it's guidance material, it's there to assist the sector. If it's not assisting you, please let us know. We're always open to hear your suggestions and receive your advice about how that guidance material can be improved. In the bottom of the slide, I'm able to say that TEQSA continues to be rated highly by parts of the sector. It's those parts of the sector that have self-accrediting authority and are low risk. And in fact, I'm reminded of Peter Shergold's joke at the very first conference dinner, where he said, in fact, TEQSA was rated most highly by those providers that have yet to meet TEQSA. But I mean, I think the explanation here is pretty simple. If you have self-accrediting authority, you look after your courses. We don't do that accreditation. The bulk of our work, 80% of our work, is actually on course accreditation, not on registrations. And so that means that low-risk, self-accrediting institutions don't have much of an interaction with us. And secondly, it's a deliberate strategy of ours that if you are low risk, then we're seeking to get out of your way. We had a terrible time in terms of timeliness of making decisions with regards to applications. And the timeframes over the last couple of years continued to deteriorate. There are a number of explanations for that, and I'll show you some graphs in a moment that will illustrate the points that I'm making. But let me say that we continued to lose staff in the last 12 months. We had to shift resources because we had a number of quite important, in fact critical issues that we had to take action on in terms of compliance assessments. And also we've been facing increasing complexity in the nature of the assessments that we've been assessing. So let me just, to illustrate those points, let me show you a couple of graphs about the relationship between risk, adverse decisions and timeliness of decision making. These graphs are taken from that assessment insight report that I mentioned at the beginning. So first of all, the relationship between the proportion of assessments that we undertake in terms of the riskiness of the provider versus the proportion of decisions that we took that were adverse. So what we have here is 8 half-yearly periods shown across the bottom of the slide, and a proportions are shown at the on the y-axis, on the vertical axis on the left. The red line is about balance of assessments to do with risk, and that basically is saying the proportion of assessments that we did in that half-yearly period that were rated as high risk. A value of 0 means that there were no high-risk providers assessed during that half-yearly period. A rating of 1 would mean that all assessments were from high-risk providers. The darker line, I'm not sure whether it's green or black, but the darker line is really the adverse decision proportion. It's very simply just the proportion of assessments that resulted in an adverse decision being taken by TEQSA, be that an application of conditions shortening the period of accreditation or registration, or indeed rejecting the applications. And again, a 0 value there would mean that all decisions that were taken were positive, there were no adverse decisions, and a ratio of 1 would mean that, a proportion of 1 would mean that all decisions were in fact adverse. And just note the very close relationship on a temporal scale between the mix of assessments that we're receiving and assessing and the adverse outcomes that are recorded. Risk and adverse outcomes track very closely together over time. And this is shown also in the following slide. Here, adverse decisions as a proportion relating to risk rating for overall risk to students. Universities are excluded from this analysis quite simply because they would absolutely swamp the low risk part of the graph, and we actually wanted to show that there are providers outside of the university sector who are rated low risk and have very good regulatory outcomes on this slide. But you'll see that we have here results shown by high risk, moderate risk and low risk, and also a category where the provider was either unrated because they were very new, initial applications, those sorts of things, or in fact where we had no confidence in the data. And for some of you, that you would recognise this as a dose response graph. There's a clear linkage between as risk goes up, so too do the proportion of adverse decisions. And it's interesting to note also that no confidence in data or initial applicants have the same outcomes as high-risk providers, which I think allows us to have some confidence in the decision that we took, that if we can't have confidence in your data, you're likely to be considered to be high risk. So then let's put that information then together with timeliness of decision making. This is a graph that shows the median number of days to making a decision by assessment type. Green are the registrations and the darker colour, the black, are the course assessments. And you'll see we're not speedy. I mean, if we approve an application unconditionally, it still takes us a median of 200 days. Some of that is related to the need to be getting expert opinions external to the agency and needing perhaps to seek more information from a provider. But by and large, 200 days or a bit over 200 days is the median if you get an unconditional approval. But as soon as we're either going to be making or heading towards making an adverse decision or a rejection of an application, you'll see that the median number of days increases, sort of 300 days plus 400 days or more. So there is an association then between risk, our workload and the complexity of our work, and the time taken to make decisions at TEQSA. So some of that explains why our decision making in the last couple of days, last couple of years has been slower, simply because we've had many more high risk assessments to undertake. But as I say, there are other factors that sit underneath that as well. So how did we go in our last provider survey and our own self-assessment of our performance as a regulator? We achieved our KPIs. These KPIs are set by government. There are 6 of them, and they were achieved. Our overall performance as a regulator continues to be rated good or excellent by more than 70% of stakeholders. But we should note there has been a drift down in that rating. It was in the low 80s, I think, in the very first survey that we conducted, 79% in 2017 and 71% this year. Last year, I showed some information which clearly demonstrated that the independent providers and the TAFEs had a more adverse view of our performance as a regulator than did the universities. And indeed, it was the for-profit sector that really was displeased with our performance, but not-for-profits sat somewhere between for-profits and universities. So this year we made a very deliberate, I made an undertaking at last year's conference to do this, and we made a very deliberate effort to engage with the independent providers and TAFEs. So we held 5 roundtables where we came to listen, and they were held in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. And out of that, I think we learned a lot from the independent providers and TAFE about their views of not only of our performance, but also of our attitudes. Their view was, first of all, that we had a very poor understanding of business outside of universities. Some expressed the view that we were negative towards non-university providers. And in fact, some even said that we were overtly biased against independent providers. There was some genuine concern, and indeed understandable concern, that the risk assessment framework that we use does not include a lot of information that would be quite complementary to independent providers. For example, in our risk assessment framework, we don't include information from the student experience survey and the quilt data. And so there was a feeling that that was leading to bias. Obviously, we were criticised for our slow decision making, and there was a feeling that we were a somewhat conservative organisation, and that was dampening approaches to innovation, particularly in terms of course construction and delivery. So we've listened very seriously to that commentary. We don't necessarily agree with some of the comments that have been delivered, but we've been very open about it. The reports of those roundtables are available publicly on our website, warts and all. And we have this year constructed our corporate plan 2018 to 22 to pick up those issues and to work constructively to try and lessen the concerns of the independent providers. Now, one of the very good things that happened at TEQSA in the last 12 months is the budget in the middle of the year announced additional resources for us, 24 million and a bit over the next 4 years, which restores our budget to $18 million per annum or thereabouts. And we also had the cap on our average staffing level, permanent Australian public service staffing, doubled. So we are in the happy position at the moment of recruiting large numbers of staff, and also hopefully this is then going to be translated in, after induction of those staff and some training, into increased speediness and responsiveness of TEQSA. Of course, the budget also announced that we're going to move from a partial cost recovery to a full cost recovery arrangement. This will align TEQSA with the whole of government approach to cost recovery and across regulators and other government agencies, and that we are still to conduct consultation regarding application-based fees and levy. I can't tell you any more than that at the moment, simply because it's in the hands of government, not in the hands of TEQSA. So last slide, what's coming up? The government's response to the review of the TEQSA Act was published 2 days ago, and obviously that is of interest to us. A large number of the changes that are being proposed actually will make our business easier to conduct and hopefully easier for you to interact with us. You're also aware that there are major reviews of the Australian Qualifications Framework and the Provider Category Standards, and indeed we have a session tomorrow with the Higher Education Standards Panel that are overseeing that work, and we'll have a chance to hear from the two people who are leading those reviews. We're continuing to work with the professions to try and reduce regulatory burden with regards to course accreditation. And indeed, in a couple of weeks' time, we're meeting with about 20 professional associations to have a serious conversation with them about how we can work more closely together to support one another and, as I say, reduce burden on providers. We're reviewing our TEQSA experts register, seeking to refresh that. We've got major work to conclude our work on admissions transparency and the reports on sexual assault and sexual harassment, and we're planning on the latter to publish a good practice guide sometime next year. And of course there's the freedom of expression on campus review being conducted by the Honourable Robert French, and since freedom of expression, freedom of intellectual inquiry is part of the standards, it's clear that we're going to have a chance to contribute our views to that review. So, in summary, 2018 has been a busy and productive year for TEQSA, but we also have a lot of work to do for the next year or two to lift our regulatory performance. So we've been given extra resources. It's our responsibility now to show that that's actually having a material effect in terms of the performance of TEQSA's regulatory work. We're going to continue to refine our risk-based approach to regulation, and we're also obviously going to be participating in a number of important policy initiatives across the sector as a whole. Thank you.
You don't get to escape yet.
No, that's fine.
Do we have questions for Professor Saunders? There is a microphone if anyone would like to come up and join us via mic. And anyone would like to lodge a question with Event Poll? Well, I'll start. So clearly we're not cruising at altitude yet.
No.
There's lots of work to be done.
Yep.
What would you think is the priority of that list on the last page of your slides? You know, there's a number of very big ticket items in there. If you only could do one thing to start with, what would it be?
Oh, I think one thing to start with, only one thing we're going to do, and that would be to improve our regulatory operations and our efficiency. It may be the least interesting thing that we might do, but I think it's really important. I mean, if we're taking a median, that means half of the distribution is above 200 days to make an approval for a course. 200 days is more than 6 months. You can imagine that if you're any sort of provider, but particularly a provider that's seeking to introduce new courses, move with the market, having to wait between 6 months and a year to get a course approved is really, that is a dead hand sitting on you. So obviously regulatory efficiency is important.
Any questions from the floor?
There's one. There's a hand up.
Yes.
Hi, Tony Palin from ISN Psychology. I have a question in regards to the universities. There are multiple departments in a university and there are multiple courses being run. Some departments perform well, other departments perform poorly, some are closed, students have moved on. It seems to me that we're always comparing the independent providers with universities. Would you capture some of that information about what happens at universities in regards to courses and departments?
Yeah. So look, that's a very good question, and it's something we probably should do next year, and that is perhaps start looking at performance at at the field of education level when making comparisons between student outcomes between institutions, but for an institution that's only offering, say, business and commerce qualifications, we can drill down on the data to look at that, say, at the performance of at the university level of a department or a faculty of business and commerce. Similarly, there are providers that only operate in the health space, the education space. We certainly would have the facility to do that, and we are very flexible in terms of and responsive to the idea that the risk assessment framework is a rigid set of 12 indicators, and they don't actually talk to the richness and the strengths of individual providers. So we are taking this. I don't want this to sound sinister, but we are now taking steps to construct what we're calling a comprehensive provider profile. In other words, to try and enhance the richness of the information that we hold on providers, so that case teams assessing individuals do get a chance to have a broader sense of the strengths and weaknesses of a particular provider. We had a one-day forum on quality assurance on online learning yesterday, and a key thing for me to come out of that is that we know that online learners do have greater difficulties in some areas of their study, higher attrition rates and the like. If you're a provider which has the majority of your students actually in that space, then we really should be taking that into context when we are making decisions. So I think we can do a lot more to make sure that comparisons are as much like with like as we possibly can.
Any more questions from the floor? I'll bounce in another question then.
Okay.
Qantas have this enormous safety record. I'm on the flight motif,
Yeah.
right? It's just the metaphor that will not end for the rest of this conference. That's a really great way of ensuring that they mitigate risk in the cockpit. And what will happen is the pilot will say, I'm going to switch the plane on, and the co-pilot's job is to actually say, are you sure you want to do that? Mm-hmm. And so on, and they kind of roll that out. It's a really lovely, very simple mechanism for ensuring that everybody knows what they're doing and everyone's on the same page. How would TEQSA think about its own relationship to that kind of risk mitigation? Who checks TEQSA in that way? Who's your co-pilot?
Well, I think, first of all, within the agency ourselves, we have a number of checks and balances. Not a regulatory decision is taken at TEQSA without at least two people looking at it. So we have the case team doing the assessment. The delegate for courses is usually the director of that particular part of TEQSA. Sometimes those courses, if there are issues around the complexity, they'll come to the Commission. For registration decisions, it's the case team, it's the director, and it's the commissioner. And the commissioners are by and large on the same page, but we certainly bring quite different perspectives to the regulatory decision making. So internally, I'm confident that the decisions that we're taking are robust, based on the information that we have at the time. Now, for decisions that are challenged, obviously the AAT uses a merit-based approach, and so therefore providers do have a chance to discover or be informed about what our negative views were, and then they have a chance to correct those, bring that to the AAT, and very often at the AAT we will have a negotiated outcome. I don't see that as a win for the provider and a loss for TEQSA. I just think that what's happened is that the interaction between the provider and the regulator has resulted in a greater degree of comfort that the improvements that are being put in at the time are in fact progressing forward.
So notwithstanding the efficiency question, there are processes that require time and require contestation in some way. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, from outside of TEQSA, who keeps an eye on us? Well, the Minister keeps an eye on us. Senate Estimates keeps an eye on us. Go 3 times a year to address the issues that the senators wish to raise with me. Sometimes they're quite vigorously pursued. And as well as that, we have the Higher Education Standards Panel, who they validate, for example, our regulator performance report. So this is not just our view, it's been tested against the Higher Education Standards Panel membership. And as well as that, we meet regularly with the Higher Education Standards Panel to let them know what we're doing, what steps that we're taking to try and improve our operational performance. They're interested in providing us with advice and those sorts of things. So there are significant numbers of checks and balances. And if we get it terribly wrong, I'm sure the providers won't hesitate to make sure that that is publicly known.
Your ultimate co-pilots in the audience. Any more questions for... Yes, here. And wait for a microphone so that we can hear you. Just here in the fourth row.
Thank you very much indeed for your presentation this morning. Just wondering, in relation to the deterioration of timeliness of responses, you talked about operational items and what TEQSA is doing about that. I'm just wondering if you could give us a bit more colour in relation to that, please.
Right, okay, so some of this is up on our website, but certainly we are taking steps to make sure that applications, when received, to receive immediate attention rather than be put on the inbox, still waiting to be addressed. We are certainly moving for providers that have a good track record in terms of course accreditation outcomes. Not to be too worried about those providers when they send in a renewal of accreditation application or a new application in the same field or the same level. Our policy there now is to send that out to at least one of our experts. If the experts say this is a good course, we will take no further action other than to provide you with the expert report for your own quality enhancement purposes. So you've got an external view that we've commissioned. We're certainly making sure that things come to the Commission, that need to come to the Commission as quickly as possible. But as I say, there are a range of steps being taken to streamline the approach. Some of this is in the offing at the moment rather than sort of firmly embedded in practice, but that is the intention over the next 12 months. You know, the last couple of years for TEQSA has been survival, just simply trying to manage the volume of work, the complexity of the work with a very small and somewhat inexperienced staff mix. But I think now, from that perspective, resources have been returned, and as I say, it's important for us, therefore, to make good use of those resources.
It's time to thank Nick. Thank you so much for your opening address. Nick Saunders.
Thank you.